Okay, welcome back. We're going to be doing solving for sides using trigonometry, and when we talk about triangles, we're talking about only right triangles. And the first thing we need to do is to understand the sides of a right triangle, and here they are, and I highlighted them accordingly. Now, of course, a triangle has three sides, and the three sides are going to come from this perspective of angle A. So I'm going to draw a little guy right there because that's the perspective I'm going to take it from. Alright, we'll start with the hypotenuse, and that doesn't matter where the guy is standing. The hypotenuse is always the hypotenuse, which is always opposite the right angle. And to abbreviate it, I'm just going to do HYP, so I don't have to write out the whole word each time. Now, from this guy, the angle, the side of the triangle that's touching the angle, which is the orange one right here, we're going to call that the adjacent side, and adjacent just means next to. Adjacent is next to or touching the angle that we're going to be dealing with. And I'm going to abbreviate that ADJ just for adjacent. And the side that's highlighted in pink here, the side that is not touching the angle and it's not the hypotenuse, we're going to call the opposite. So the opposite side of the right triangle is never touching the angle that we're dealing with. Okay, so I've got my three sides, and throughout this lesson I'm just going to keep them highlighted so we always know which color is which side. Okay, so write this down because we're going to be using this throughout the lesson today. Okay, now let's look at the three basic trig ratios. Now, first of all, we need to remember what ratios are. Okay, they're a comparison of numbers here. And each ratio we have here, this is pronounced sine. This says the sine of angle A equals the ratio of the opposite side to the hypotenuse. This stands for cosine, and that's another ratio, which is a fraction here. And the cosine of angle A equals the adjacent side divided by the hypotenuse. And finally, we have the tangent of angle A, and this equals the opposite side divided by the adjacent. Now, hopefully, previously, your teacher has explained a little bit more what these ratios mean. Today, what I'm going to do is just basically use these ratios to find sides of a right triangle. There's a lot more to these, so today's lesson is just a how-to to finding sides. So hopefully, we've gone over this a little bit more before viewing this video. All right, and the famous kind of mnemonic device to remember all of this is Sohcahtoa. And Sohcahtoa just stands for sine. The sine ratio deals with opposite and hypotenuse, SOH. The cosine ratio deals with adjacent over hypotenuse. So it's just the letters of each ratio, cosine, adjacent, hypotenuse, and tangent, tangent, opposite, and adjacent, opposite and adjacent. So this part down here is just a way to remember it. Okay, just like BEDMAS or something like that. But these three up here, these are the definitions, and these are what we're going to be using for every single problem right here. These are the definitions of the sine of angle A. These are the equations that we're going to use to solve them. So we're going to have this in front of us for every single problem today. Okay, now I'm going to go over the steps on finding sides. And I'm going to write these down, so when we work these problems, we're going to have the steps in front of us, we're going to have the definitions of the ratios, and we're going to have the right triangle labeled like this. Okay, so here are steps for doing this. First step. If it's a word problem with no drawing, we're going to want to draw a diagram. And our diagram better have some sort of right triangle in there. Okay, all the examples I'm doing today are going to start with the diagram already drawn. Second step. Our second step, we're going to label two sides of that right triangle. I know it has three sides, but we're only going to label two. Now the two sides I'm going to label are, one of them is going to be the side that I'm given, like 14 meters, 23 centimeters, whatever, and the other one's going to be the one I'm trying to figure out, X, or Z, or Y, or whatever. Now what you're going to label them are these names over here that I talked about. So we've got opposite, adjacent, and hypotenuse. I know there's three choices, but we're still only going to label two. Okay, your third step, once you've labeled your two sides, you're going to use that Sohcahtoa thing to determine which trig ratio you're going to use, sine, cosine, or tangent. So once you label those two sides, for example, if you label adjacent and hypotenuse, well, you're going to use cosine. If you label opposite and hypotenuse, you're going to use sine. And if you use opposite and adjacent, you're going to use tangent. Now, your fourth step is to set up your equation. Well, your equation's already right here. So when I say set up the equation, here's where most of my students went, well, where's my equation? Well, they're right here. Remember, an equation is just an equal sign with two things on both sides. So you're going to be given the angle, and you're going to be given one side, and the other one's going to be x. So you set up your equation by using one of these trig ratios up here. And lastly, we're going to solve for the variable, which is going to be x in this case. And just a couple of hints on that. If I have this expression right here, this equation, 4 equals 8 divided by 2, that's true. So that's a number family. So what that means is, if I don't know this one up there, if I don't know that value up there, it's 4 times 2 equals that top number. And if I don't know this bottom number here, which is 2, then it's 8 divided by 4 equals 2. So I bring this back for when we're solving trig equations, because this equation right here is really no different than any of these up here. Okay, and I wrote that out like, if x is on top, that means we don't know that value right there, then we multiply to solve. 4 times 2 equals 8. And if x is on bottom, meaning we don't know that bottom number, we divide to solve. Now the division matters which order you go, so it's 8 divided by 4 equals that unknown. But we won't have 8 and 4, we'll have different values up here. So it's this numerator divided by the trig ratio will give us that side down there. So let's do some problems. Okay, first one. From the given angle, that's the perspective I'm looking from. Now, you don't have to draw this little guy, but it's just to give you a reference. So what that means, and I have my cheat sheet in front of me, you got to have this right in front of you when you're working out these problems, is the two sides that I label are, that one's the opposite, because it's not touching the angle, and this guy's always the hypotenuse. So which trig ratio do I use? You guessed it, it's sine. So now, once I figure out the trig ratio, which is sine, I set up my equation. And how I set it up is I substitute everything in here. Remember, A stands for the angle, which in this case is 70 degrees. Okay, notice I didn't label this side because I don't need it. So now remember, if x is on top, I multiply to solve, and multiplying doesn't matter the order. And now I multiply the sine of 70 times 17 degrees times 17, and I don't need to work this out separately. So, for example, I just work all this out on the calculator on one go to get the length of that side, which in this case would be 15.97 to 2 decimal places. Okay, let's try another one. This time, you try to label the two sides. Remember, you're from this perspective right now. After you label the two sides, see if you can determine the trig ratio and set up the equation. Go ahead and pause it and try it on your own. If you picked tangent, good job, because remember we do that Sohcahtoa, and since it's opposite and adjacent, that's tangent. Set up your equation, solve. Okay, let's try one more and see how you do. Okay, last one. Label two sides and see which trig ratio we're going to use for this one. If you labeled adjacent and hypotenuse, good job. And adjacent and hypotenuse have to do with cosine. Set up the equation. There's the equation. And what do we do when x is on bottom? Hint is right here. If x is on bottom, divide to solve. Okay, so that's finding sides using trigonometry. Happy solving. Hope you can handle this stuff. Just a reminder, when you're working on the calculator here, you want to make sure you're in degrees mode. You want to make sure it has D for degrees, which is on one of your modes on your calculator, and you look for the D right there, not radians. So that's how we do it, and good luck.